Today, I'm going to be showing you how to draw trees, specifically a pine tree, an oak tree, and then a tree that's a little bit older with fewer leaves on it, where you can really see the bark and the limbs. We're going to go into each tree individually, and I'll show you step by step how to create them. I also have timestamps set up for each of the 3 trees, so if you just want to jump to one type, you can click that bookmark and go there. All we're going to be using for this tutorial is a B pencil. If you have one that's slightly darker or lighter, that should work too. So now we're going to start with the pine tree. When I draw pine trees, I like to start with a really kind of loose outline of almost like a triangle, just to help me with the shape. And then we'll come back and erase that later. What I think about here is I want variety. You don't want really consistent, super straight lines. And the reason we want to do this really loose outline, it's basically just like a thin triangle, is as we start adding some of the shadow areas, we want to make sure those are going to come together in the correct form of the pine tree. So now that I have this light outline, I'm going to start shading some of the darker regions of the tree. We don't want to go super dark at this point. And then in terms of the stroke of the line, you just want to draw it in the direction that the limbs are going to be growing out of the center of the tree. Again, we're just looking for those shadow regions on the tree, the darker portions. As you can see, this isn't looking perfectly symmetrical, which is what we want if we want to create a realistic tree. And then on the right side of this one, it's actually the side that's getting hit with sunlight. So we're going to have a little bit less shadow on this side. You want some branches sticking out a little further than others. Okay, so now that we have some initial shadows drawn in here, I'd recommend removing any of that outline that's not been covered up that we drew initially. If you leave it behind, that should be okay, but I like to get rid of it. Okay, so now I'm just going to kind of go over the areas just a little bit more to accentuate those darker regions and give just a little bit more form. Okay, so now I'm going to start drawing in a little bit of the midtones. And the midtones are sort of the medium gray color. So it's not light gray, it's not the dark gray, it's kind of what's in the middle. And what you're going to do is kind of shade the midtone a little bit above where we put the shadows. You can see I'm just kind of doing this flicking motion a lot. What's helping create that correct shape or form of the branches. And as you're doing this, if you see areas that you missed, like I did with adding some of the darker portions, you can, of course, add those in at this time. And in my experience, what really helps the tree to pop and look three-dimensional is having those transitions of the dark to light, especially if they're close to each other. Because that's what you're going to see in trees in nature. So I'm trying my best to kind of capture that. Coming back over here, I see there's some shadow areas I missed. The line itself doesn't matter so much. I mean, it's important, but what I think is more important is getting the darkness, the lightness, getting those value areas correct and having that variety. That's going to ultimately give it the overall shape and make it look like a pine tree. So up in this region, I need add a little bit more of that variation I'm talking about. One thing I'm seeing I can improve upon is create some situations or some cases here where you are kind of drawing that typical kind of branch look you would expect to see in a drawing, and that's going to help with the realism as well. As you can see, it's starting to come together a little bit, still needing to fill in some areas. You want to have some pockets with the highlights on the shadow side here, so it's not fully dark and in shadow. Then on this side, you want to have the opposite. You want to have some pockets of shadow amidst the lighter side of the tree. Okay, we are almost through with this tree. Just want to see if there's any other areas I can kind of bump the darkness up. Because again, the contrast is what's really going to help sell it. The other thing, you want to kind of have some branches popping out like that. Just a couple more pockets of the shadow over here, just to make sure this kind of looks like a whole object on this side and it's not see-through. You can do that just with kind of making sure there's not areas that are completely white, and then adding in some dark zones and kind of pulling those over to the shadow side. I completely forgot about the top here. This needs a little bit of work. Fortunately, it's much smaller, so it should be easier to work with. Just kind of doing the flicking motion again. And then at the top, kind of do some. And that's our pine tree. So as you can see, we're not drawing each individual limb, every single needle, but we're using shading to create the effect of those parts of the tree existing. And then our brains will fill in the gaps. The next tree we're going to create is an oak tree. We're going to use some of the same principles for this one. Again, I like to start by creating just a really loose shape of the leaves. So when we're doing our shading, we are going to maintain the correct shape. So we're going to kind of just draw a half circle. Looks like a big popsicle. Okay, it doesn't have to be perfect. Just need a kind of a starting point. And so what I'm going to do now is go around that and make it look a little rougher, a little looser. So I'm just going around and kind of making some rough edges. If you look at the outline of an oak tree, it's not a perfect popsicle shape, right? So we need to create some variation again. That's going to make it look really realistic. Over here, it kind of dips in a little bit. So then I'm going to come here and erase that initial outline we drew. Then we'll be left with this more natural looking outline. If you are really good at estimating shapes and things like that, you can skip that step I just did where I did that initial outline and just take a stab at drawing the shape as it is. But this is kind of a little trick that helps me. Okay. So next, I like to start with the trunk and establish that really dark value, because that's the darkest part of the tree. And so we don't want any of the leaves up here to be, much darker than down here. So this is usually a good place to start. Don't overthink the trunk. It looks as simple as it it looks as simple as it is. Don't need a whole lot going on with this one. And then you can do a little bit of some branches stretching up into the leaves. Try and create some variation here, just like we talked about with the pine tree variation is what'll help sell it. So just kind of doing a flicking motion. Again, this left side is much darker. Leaving these spaces here for leaves to kind of be poking through. Okay, we can always come back and touch up the trunk later, but that looks pretty good for now. Okay, so now we're going to kind of do the same approach with the oak that we did, the pine tree. We're going to start looking for those darkest values, like the shadow shapes of the tree. And in an oak, they're generally going to kind of look like this, kind of like a smushed squiggle. And then as we get to the topper portion of the tree, the squiggle will get more smushed this way. So it'll get thinner, and that'll really help create the sense of depth and height on the tree. Just kind of go through and add these shapes all around. We'll start here at the trunk and then work our way up. And then this right side here is actually just darker overall. So I'm going to kind of make those shapes a little larger. Some people like to do little circles, kind of circle motions on the tree. You can try that if you want, if that works better for you. I kind of like doing this squiggle shape. And then, like I said, as we get to the top, we're going to start kind of doing the shapes, but they're closer to each other like this. Because we're just seeing the very tops of those patches of leaves, the top of the tree. Again, making sure looks like there's variation and kind of some different shapes going on. And then same thing with the pine tree. As you can see, we're not drawing every single little leaf. We're using the magic of shading to kind of give the illusion of all the individual leaves. And this will take a lot less time, and I think it creates a really pretty aesthetic as well. Okay, so now above each of these kind of shadow zones we created, we want to come in and kind of do a lightly shaded midtone above them. And that's going to help create some more shape around those areas. Still continuing that same process. And then next we're going to start adding in a little bit more of the branches in the upper region. Then we're going to expand some of these darker zones where it makes sense. And right in this area, you can see some limbs peeking through. And I'm going to come back to these original limbs down here and kind of fill in the leaves portion. And you want to make your darkest leaves lighter than your limbs coming off the trunk here. If you make them all the same shade, the limbs and the leaves will get lost. So we need to continue this process. Go back to areas that look loosely defined and fill those in with the right value. So up top here, I can see I need a little bit more of the mid-tone Then here I need a little bit more of the darker value. And it's just the same process, just kind of, you can even squint your eyes sometimes. That'll help you recognize values a little easier. But once you practice this just a couple times, you'll get it down, no problem. This one does take the longest. If your tree isn't looking three-dimensional, one possible problem could be you're not using the full scale of value. You're not using dark enough shading and light enough shading, because that spectrum of shading is what's going to make it look three-dimensional. This region here closest to the trunk is generally going to be a little darker. Going back now and adding that in. You can see I need to make my trunk a little darker than it was. And then this side over here is more in shadow, so I'm going to make this a little more dark than it is on the left side. Still having some regions where it's being hit with a highlight. And just make sure you're drawing in areas where the limbs are peeking through. At first, I don't think this looks anything like an oak tree when you're first, drawing the outline and starting to shade in some of the areas, but just gotta trust the process, go through with the full shading, and it'll likely come together. The top here, I'm gonna erase a little bit, put fewer of those lines up here to help create that illusion of shape. And then as you're going, always stop periodically and just see if there's parts that you need to darken or lighten a little bit. Just about done. And then this is a tree where you could spend double the amount of time just being a little more meticulous with the shading and really trying to line it up with what we see in the reference. Now I'm just kind of looking over it, seeing any other areas that need to be adjusted. I think this region could be a little darker. Just going to go through, and this is the side where the sun's hitting. And if we want to create that illusion of 3D, need to make this side a little darker. Just now going through and playing with the shape a little bit more. I think that looks pretty good for our oak tree. Okay, last but not least, we are going to draw the tree that is maybe starting to transition into fall, starting to lose some leaves. We'll be drawing that one right here. What's really cool about this one is we're seeing a lot more of the trunk, so we can really play with the shading on the limbs and the trunk to make this tree look three-dimensional. So to start, we're going to draw the rough shape of the trunk and the limbs, and then we'll come back and add the little bits of leaves after that. And as you're drawing this, make sure you're drawing kind of some interesting shapes. It's gonna help make it look a lot more realistic. You're probably noticing that theme by now. I've said it a couple times. And just keep this really light. And of course, be mindful about the width as you're going up is going to, of course, need to get thinner for that to look realistic. I mean, there are trees that break that rule, but If you want to try and go for the most realistic look, then I'd recommend following that pattern. There's really no right way to do this. You can be looking at a reference, of course, or just kind of go off and draw any kind of spindly shapes that you want. Okay, and then next what we're going to do is shade the bark a little bit to make it look three-dimensional. So in the reference I'm looking at, the sun is coming in from this side, and so on the right side of the trunk is where we're going to have the darkest values. So I'm going to start drawing those in. I don't like drawing them in extremely dark right off the bat. I like drawing them kind of one step away from that, so we can always bump them up in areas that are extra dark, but that is up to you if you want to do that as well. And then we're kind of doing these scratchy lines on the tree to try to emulate the bark. There's little pockets of shadow along here. And this branch is a lot more in shadow, probably being covered up with leaves. And there's a cool little pocket here of some more of a shadow area. Maybe a little critter is going to climb up, hang out. And then once you get up into this region where we're going to have a lot of our leaves, you can not do a whole lot of detail right now if you want. I'm just going to do a little bit of light shading up there. But we'll come back after we've put a lot of the leaves in, and we can adjust that. Then I'm going to go here, bump up the darkness just a tiny bit right on the edge, right on the outline. Try and make this look more rounded. One of the ways to do that is just sharper contrast between values. Okay, so now let's go ahead and add a little bit of our patches of leaves on this one. We're going to follow somewhat of a similar strategy as we did on the oak. Just kind of shading, starting with maybe a loose outline of the leaved area. Just really loosely shading. We're not drawing every individual leaf. Then what we're going to come back and do is add some darker regions of the leaves, and that's going to make it all come together for us. Just try and create some interesting shapes, variety in your line shape, everything like that. Just going to help sell it more. Here we'll just do smaller region of leaves. Then on this side, we're going to follow the same kind of trend. There's not a lot of leaves on the bottom part of this branch in the reference. And it's a little darker here. Go ahead and fill that in for now. And then we're going to fill in some of these areas here. Some light shading just to suggest leaves are down in this region as well. We want our branches to have the darkest value for the most part. We can have a few exceptions of that, but if you really want this to look like a tree with minimal leaves and what's really showing through is the trunk and the limbs, then that's what I would do. And we just have some little batches of leaves kind of along the edges here. Okay, so now that we have a rough outline of our leaves, let's go back, add a little more detail, add some darker regions, So just looking at your reference, where in the leaved areas is it a little darker? Then you want to try and add that in. I'm here just starting to do these little circles, little squiggly motions. Then where it's lighter, I'm doing a lighter version of that. And where it's a little darker, I'm going to do a darker version of that. Just pressing down a little harder. This tree has a ton of small branches. I'm not going to draw all of these, but we do want to draw a couple more kind of shooting up into the leaved areas. Just remember to make them variety of shapes and not always lines that are going all the way from the tip of the branch down to the limb, because we want it to kind of feel like those limbs are peeking out a little bit. We're not seeing the full thing. Then we want to look and see where places we can maybe bump the contrast up a little bit. Add some darker areas up here. This area needs a little bit of TLC. And the shape of the leaves here is a bit basic, so I'm going to try and make this shape a little more interesting. And then going through and just seeing any other places we can darken or add a little bit more leaves just for some final touches. So that's how you draw 3 different trees in pencil. I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section. Thanks for watching.